Welcome to One Dream Podcast. I'm Leah Wilson, and today I have a special guest with me today to talk about a subject that you may or may not have considered. Do parents have a right to a second medical opinion? Over the last year, the industry and government have began to disagree on fundamental medical recommendations, and we are seeing more transparency and more coverage on the varying options that exist. And we are even seeing natural health given a spot in government and mainstream media, yet parents are backed into a corner and forced to comply with mainstream recommendations in the exam room. And the threats are real, and no one wants to talk about it because it's an ugly subject. But you need to know the facts if A, you want to be free, and B, if you want to see parents able to deny a product with a black box warning without losing custody of their child. So my guest today is Bailey Templeton, a mother, advocate, and proudly endorsed candidate of Stand for Health Freedom for Illinois' 94th State House District. So thank you so much, Bailey, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is such an important topic that I'm so glad to be able to talk about with you.
Yes, well, we appreciate you coming to share your experience. And I know that it's not easy to rehash things that are traumatic, if that's an okay word to use for families. And your son was diagnosed with cancer, and your treatment decision led to your worst nightmare. And we
Absolutely.
want to know what happened so that others can learn from you. So, how old was your son, and what was the medical situation that led to state intervention?
Absolutely. So when my son was 9 years old, he was experiencing what we would assume were growing pains in his leg. At that age, you expect for children to have some type of pains in their legs and their arms as they're getting bigger. But accompanied with a bloody nose, I took him into the ER one day with some concerns because the bloody nose wasn't like one I've seen. I've been a mom for 13 years. So this one was a little bit more alarming for me than any other bloody nose my kids had had before. And with that experience, we went to the ER and they did some x rays. And that day, they told me that the only option was that my child had a tumor. But recorded on the medical diagnostic, there was multiple different diagnoses that could have been there for my son that day, including different autoimmune disorders and other cancers as well. And that started us on probably the worst experience of our life as we tried to figure out what was going on with my son and tried to find a doctor to speak to who wasn't exactly who we were being sent to through Medicaid. When you're on Medicaid, you're kind of told who you have to go see and you've got no other options. But I felt very uncomfortable with the options that they gave me. And I did my own research to figure out different things to treat naturally and things that you could do alongside of chemotherapy to make sure that your child can live through the chemotherapy treatments that they are offering. And my pushback to the medical field ended in my rights as a mother being taken away.
So you went into the ER, is that what I understand?
Yeah.
And with a bloody nose, no real alarming symptoms outside of that. And was it that day that you got the diagnosis of cancer?
Well, they technically can't diagnose cancer until there's a biopsy performed. But from the words of the doctor that day, he pretty much had me completely believing that my child had cancer within one x ray and one visit to the doctor. So that kind of puts this fear in a mother's mind, especially knowing the consequences of chemotherapy, the consequences of radiation, and all these other treatments that may be administered on a child with cancer. Especially if you know a little bit about the natural health realm, if you know a little bit about holistic healing, you are really adverse to want to jump in directly to poison your child.
And so you knew at that point in time that you had some research to do. Did you also know at
Absolutely.
that point in time that you were an adversary to the medical system, or was it later that you figured out that your opinions were flying in the face of theirs?
Well, that actually would have to go back to 2015, right after my son was born, when he had his 18-month vaccinations. And when he was vaccinated at 18 months, my son, within 4 hours, developed a very severe seizure and a skin rash on his body that lasted over a year. So he is listed in the VAERS database for an adverse reaction to his vaccines. And at that point, I never vaccinated my son again or his youngest brother in fear of having the same response with his younger brother. And at that point, I knew I was an adversary to the medical field just because I said no to the vaccine schedule.
Hmm. And with this specific situation with the cancer diagnosis in your 9-year-old, did you go home that night thinking, "This is on me, I need to figure this out," or did you go home that night thinking, "My rights are in danger?"
I went home thinking that I need to do everything that I possibly can. At this point, they had referred us on to OSF in Peoria to get a or not a biopsy, an MRI done of my son just to confirm the diagnosis. And from there, they wanted to send us to St. Jude's in Memphis, Tennessee to do the biopsy and all the other workup to get a diagnosis. So at this point, we didn't have a diagnosis, but in my heart, I felt that there was something seriously wrong with my son and that I needed to take action however I could. So that led into many sleepless nights, much research done. And I immediately started him on certain vitamins like vitamin D and certain things that actually do really help a body when you have cancer.
So then when was it that they told you that your rights were going to be threatened? What happened with that?
Sure. On December 28th of 2023, my son was officially diagnosed with osteosarcoma cancer, which is a bone cancer located right above his knee. And that experience was very rough as it was. The doctor who did the biopsy was not very nice. He just gave me a really icky feeling about the way that he was handling things. In fact, he told me that he was hoping that this was a different type of cancer before he did the biopsy. So I was just at this point, very upset with the medical industry and the way that they've been treating my son. He was assaulted at St. Jude's. There was just so many things that happened to him in this small spectrum of time that I just felt very uncomfortable and just wanted to go find a doctor who I could speak to. I had sent some of the studies to different oncologists and said, hey, what about this? This is shown in vivo and in vitro to be successful against this specific type of cancer. I studied everything due to that specific cancer. As soon as I had the diagnosis, I did every study that I could. And every doctor said, well, that won't work. We haven't done that in human studies. It's only been in animals, in vivo, in vitro. It's never been done on a human. But in my mind, at this point, I figured I should just do whatever I can. And if you can get a vitamin over the counter or feed them certain foods that will help them, might as well do it, especially when you know you're leading into chemotherapy. And it wasn't until 25 days after diagnosis when Illinois DCFS showed up at my door with a police officer to tell me that I needed to have a meeting with the doctor the next day to discuss the surgical options. Of course, I complied. I wanted to hear what surgical options that we had. But in this process, we've got a federal lawsuit right now about this. So I can't really go too much into details, but I can tell you to look it up online. Um, it resulted in the investigator and the supervisor lying to the state's attorney to obtain a warrant to take my child 25 days after his diagnosis with cancer. And it was about 7.5 hours they were on my property without a warrant. And then they loaded him up in a ambulance and took him away at 11:30 at night.
So at that point in time, had you already declined treatment?
I never declined any treatment. There's nowhere on the record that I ever declined to do anything. I just specifically asked over and over again for a second opinion and referrals to be sent to the hospital of my choice. I offered to pay out of pocket. I was paying out of pocket to obtain certain medications for him, anyways. I had a fundraiser up and I was willing to do whatever it took to make sure that my son essentially wouldn't lose any body parts or lose his life in this battle that he was fighting.
So what was the justification given that night for them to load him up and remove him from the home? What did they say justified that measure?
Anticipatory medical neglect. They anticipated that I would not do what I was supposed to according to the medical field to heal my son's cancer.
Wow, anticipatory. So how many days could you see him? After they took him away in the ambulance, were you able to see him whenever you wanted, or how long was he away from you?
So when they originally took him in the ambulance, the police officer that was at my home said to let me go with him. Mind you, this is a 9-year-old child who's been diagnosed with cancer, who has just spent the past 7.5 hours terrified in his bedroom with his family. His two brothers were there too. So it's just myself and my three boys at home when this happened. So we were all very traumatized at this moment. So they did allow me to go with him, but it was within 2 or 3 days. You've got 48 hours after a case opens to be seen in front of a judge. And within 48 hours, I no longer had any rights to my child, and they kicked me out of the hospital. And I was allowed to see him 4 hours twice a week for the first 3 months.
Did that justification change then when they kicked you out of the hospital? Was it still anticipated medical neglect or was there other justification?
When they took my son in the middle of the night, I filled a suitcase with all of the supplements that I was using for my child, minus cannabis. He was on medical cannabis. I did not pack that up to bring with us, but that was something I could explain to them. But my idea was to show this to whatever hospital he went to of what I was doing and kind of battle the fact that this is not medical neglect and that I'd done oodles of research to figure out what to give him. And these are over the counter vitamins. It's like your daily multivitamins, just a broken down complex of which he precisely needed for healing. And because I brought that suitcase of supplements, that was their reasoning to kick me out of the hospital. They said they weren't sure, they didn't know what I was bringing to him, and that they were afraid I was drugging my child in the hospital with vitamin D. But regardless, that's what their allegations were. They said that they didn't know what was in the bag, and I could no longer be around him without supervision.
Wow. So, from my legal experience, what justifies medical neglect is that the mother does not have a plan. It doesn't have to be a specific plan, but a plan to care for her child's medical need. And for all intents and purposes, it looked like you had gone above and beyond to create a plan for your child. And so at that point in time, when the hospital was now the authority in your child's life, was he also assigned like a foster parent or what did that look like for guardianship?
Immediately after my son was taken, I had a best friend of mine who said, I'll take him. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll get him to the appointments, let him come home with me. And Illinois DCFS had a million reasons why they wouldn't do that. And they didn't even decide on any placement or anyone to visit him. I mean, my friends, my family, nobody was allowed to visit him. We had those 2 times a week, 4-hour meetings. I was allowed to bring his brothers. But if I had someone else come with me, they weren't allowed in the room with him. They kept my son so isolated for those first 2.5, 3 months that honestly, with the studies, if you read into it, isolating a cancer patient, especially one on chemotherapy, can cause metastases, it can cause death, and a lot of other horrible things that could happen. So, the way that the hospital and DCFS handled this, I don't think it was appropriate. I don't think it was in the best interest of my son. And I did have a plan. I had a very thorough plan. I'd called all over the country and all over the world to speak with other doctors who had worked with osteosarcoma. Because what we were facing here is my son's leg being amputated. And I have 3 boys. He is my most athletic, daredevil little boy. He likes to climb trees and jump on the trampoline and ride his dirt bike. So I knew with an amputation, it would really reduce his quality of life. And I know that bones can heal. A lot of people know, especially chiropractors, they know that bones can heal. I myself, I have osteoporosis and I'd broken my foot and never needed surgery because bones can heal if you supplement your body correctly. And as somebody with autoimmune disorders like I am, I don't use conventional treatments for my autoimmune disorders. And I seem to be doing just fine with fighting them with natural supplements. So I thought maybe my son, with his aversion to medical intervention with his vaccines, that maybe he was more of a natural bound child like I am.
I mean, it makes perfect sense as a mother that
Mhm.
you're pursuing the route that would grant your child healing, the healing
Right.
that you visioned for him, that you wanted for him. And then the next thing you know, you're kicked out of the equation. So, were you kept in the loop those days that you were kicked out of the hospital? Were they telling you, Bailey, here's what the options are, here's what we're going to do? Did you have any say in the treatment that was administered?
Um, no, not really. In fact, DCFS tried to have the medical records taken from me so I wouldn't have access to them at all because I was consistently watching anytime there was a new test result. I was at home seeing what are they doing to my son. Luckily, I gave him a tablet when he was up there so he could call me and talk to me when he wanted to. But watching your child get injections and needles put into their chest over a tablet while they're screaming for help, it's honestly was probably more traumatizing to have to see that and not be able to comfort him. Um, And that's just the way that they handled things. I had no consent. There was no informed consent throughout any of this, especially in those first 3 months. And everything was kind of done behind closed doors. In fact, they had written on his chart that he was suicidal and homicidal because of comments he made as a 9-year-old boy locked in a hospital alone. They took away his Bible. They took away his homeschooling materials. I brought him in fresh fruit. They would just leave it on the counter to rot so he couldn't eat it. They'd throw away his food. It was like they were setting up my child to not survive and to just have a clean study of what this chemotherapy does to a child. And I did everything I could to make sure he was receiving what he needed to be able to make it through this.
Well, it sounds like you didn't give up. And so
Yep.
how many days was it in the hospital for your 9-year-old? And when he left the hospital, where did he go? Did he come home with you or go somewhere else?
Well, between the 3 hospitals that they took him to, he was locked in the hospitals for 123 days straight. He was only allowed to go outside twice, and one of those time was for an ambulance ride. The other time is because there was a really wonderful nurse in Chicago, and I knew that my son was about to have surgery, and I said, "Can we please get him outside? Can we just he hasn't been outside in months. Can we get him outside?" And she took us up on the roof so he could see the eclipse that day. And it was very great. We did find some wonderful people in the medical field, mostly the nurses, some pharmacists were great, but I think the driving force was not as ideal for him. But in total, after the 123 days, at this point, they have amputated his leg and they sent him home to my friend who had offered right in the beginning to take him. Now it was appropriate that she could have him. And she had custody of my son for about 14, 15 days before I'd won in court, case dismissed with prejudice, and he was back home with me.
Wow. So you ended up winning the case. What does that mean to win? I mean, obviously it meant he got to come home with you, but does it mean he should have never been taken away to begin with?
Yeah, I would believe that a case being dismissed with prejudice means they found no wrongdoing. So I believe that the 120 days he was in the hospital and the 140 days that I did not have any rights over my child, I believe they were wrong. I think that they should have never done this to my family. And by the grace of God, my son survived. He's 11 years old now. He breaks his prosthetic all the time because he's just so rough. But the prosthetic that DCFS and the hospitals wanted to give him was an interior 3D printed prosthetic. And it's brand new. It hasn't even been around for 5 years. The efficacy studies are not there. I have actually met an individual who had this and it failed. So now they've got just skin and muscle and no bone in the area where it was supposed to be. My discernment screamed at me that we couldn't do this. If my son would have gotten the surgery that they wanted to give him, he would have already broken that internal prosthetic, considering the fact that he's broken so many metal exterior prosthetics. 3D print is so flimsy. I have fear he would have broken it and been disfigured even worse for the rest of his life and had no function. So what we did have is a rotation plasty. So it looks very weird, and the surgeon kept on telling me that I wouldn't want that because it looks weird. But my son can jump on trampolines, he can climb, and he could ride his dirt bike again.
So what does a rotation plasty mean?
Well, they cut the child's bone at the hip and down to wherever the tumor is. Most of the time with osteosarcoma, you're going to find the original tumor in the arm or in the leg, about around that spot where they do the childhood vaccines. And they cut down to there. And for his case, they cut all the way down to the knee and cut off the knee. And then they take the final part of the leg down to the foot and attach it back at the hip backwards. So my son does have half a backwards leg, and he will have it for the rest of his life. And it's not what we wanted. I wanted to avoid surgery in the first place in any way, shape, or form. Pathology showed that we should have avoided surgery, and there's no way I can go back on it, but what I can do is let people know that this is happening. And at the time, parents are gag ordered. They're not allowed to tell you what's happening. And sometimes these children don't even make it out alive.
Mm. So is he cancer free today?
From every scan we've taken, there's never been a spot of cancer since.
Wow. And
And like I
with
said, with
all
pathology, I don't know. I could never say it wasn't cancer. I could never say it is because it was stuck in this network of doctors the entire time and no one was ever allowed to look at it with an outside eye.
And we all know that the number one variable in a complex medical situation is having a robust advocate. And that's what you were trying to be for your child before the state came along and complicated it. And it's just I'm so sorry that you went through this. We don't want anyone to have to go through this, and I just want to hear from you. With all the pressure that the state put on you, did it ever begin to make you doubt yourself, or were you able to stay confident through it all?
That's a hard one to answer. I think I doubted myself the entire time. And I blamed myself the entire time that my son was taken from me and told myself, well, if we would have just started, if we would have just done the chemotherapy as soon as they told us to. But God does things for reasons, and we had to go through this. But I tried. I tried my best to be his best advocate. And there's another endorsee of yours, Angel Oakley. She actually showed up at the hospital and was physically removed just for asking questions about what they were doing to my child. So
Mm,
in this system, they're not allowed an advocate. And if you have any reservations, you are at risk of losing your child. There's cases of cystic fibrosis where children are removed, cancer diagnoses, vitamin D deficiencies and rickets and Ehlers-Danlos, and your children get removed without looking at the underlying data and how much work that parents have done to try to protect their child in the meantime. And it starts asking questions or raising questions about the financial incentive of why they would do this to a family. They would have made roughly the same amount of money if they kept my child in my custody, but instead they had him in a hospital long term, which costs so much money to Illinois taxpayers to do this. And looking into the numbers and the rising in those costs, I am very worried that they are doing this to other families.
mm. And how was your son when he returned to you? Did he integrate back into your care just fine? Or I know that they say that once a child is removed, it is a life-changing event.
I think that I've been a homeschooling mom almost his entire life, and they've spent pretty much their entire life with me. They don't go to daycare, they don't go to babysitters. So I think it was really easy for him to come home and to be with his family again and to be with his pets again. He really missed his cat. He's got his best friend cat. He really missed him. So it wasn't really hard for us to integrate back into home, but there are residual issues for him and a lot of trauma involved in what happened to him. It's very hard to get him to even go to a doctor checkup anymore.
Mm. I mean, they had labeled him suicidal and homicidal, but you don't experience that in the home upon his return?
No, the homicidal was after a physical exam where a male doctor walked in and grabbed my son's privates, but didn't tell him he was going to, nothing. And my son had never had a school physical. So we've always been very strict about nobody touches you below the belt. So when my son made a comment about what happened, they charted him as homicidal. For suicidal, they wanted to look at another inappropriate part of my son's body right after I had left for a visit. And he called me crying. He said, I don't want to do this. To me, it raised questions of why didn't you have me do it while I was there? I'm his mother. But they ended up taking everything from him because he cried and he said he'd rather die than to show them this part of his body. And these are
Wow.
definitions and diagnoses that will follow him for the rest of his life just because they wrote them down.
That's the thing. Once it becomes a part of your record, it shapes your future, and, I mean, we speak against that, right? We speak against that
Right.
God will use this, but it is not to be taken lightly, and as your
Right.
story developed, you didn't just win back your son. You didn't just win back a case with prejudice. You started demanding transparency. You
Right.
filed records requests to DCFS, and you wanted to know how taxpayer dollars are being used. Tell us what you found and why were you inspired to keep digging instead of saying, "I'm closing this door"?
The day of my son's port removal and where he rang the bell was the day that we packed up everything and went directly to Washington, D.C. And that was on January 7th of 2025. Um, going to Washington, D.C. and telling the story of what happened over and over and over again, it number one, desensitized it. It made it a little bit easier to talk about. But also, I realized that nothing was going to be done about what I said unless I did it myself or found people to do it with me. So when I came home, I just started asking questions and I'd be up in the middle of the night. This is something that haunts me and will haunt me for the rest of my life of how this happened, unless I can make a huge change out of it. And I think that's just the way that God made me. If you poke the bear is going to make sure that your slate is clean too. So what I started to do was ask about missing children in Illinois DCFS care. They spent so much time, the higher ups in the system spent so much time showing up to my son's court dates and trying to take him away from me in 2024 that I was just curious if they were paying attention to the other kids. And with the records request, we found that there's 193 missing Illinois foster children. And as of last week, a senator has put out a Senate bill to find these children. So that is a huge boost of confidence for me that I'm doing the right thing when I see actual change happening when I put the word out. Well, then looking into the finances, we find a 129,000% increase in Medicaid spending for Illinois DCFS. What's happening to the children?
What does that mean that a child is missing? It means that they were taken into custody and now there's no knowledge of their whereabouts?
Yeah, there is some of them that are listed as abducted. There is some that is listed as whereabouts unknown and then unknown contact. So some of them, and speaking to people as I have gone on this campaign trail, I'm learning more about this. The child can go missing as long as they call their caseworker, that's fine. They're just going to let them stay gone as long as they contact their caseworker and they would be listed as whereabouts unknown. But unknown contact means they haven't had any contact with them at all and they're not looking for them. So I actually asked all the responsive agencies who should be involved in finding these kids, other than the Illinois State Police. I haven't sent them any FOIAs yet, but Attorney General's office, Executive General, Inspector General, and DCFS, they have no records of these missing kids. And in fact, they kind of lied on the numbers they gave me. Once I got the news involved, they put in their own records request and they took way beyond the FOIA restrictions to turn in the news FOIAs, but they changed their numbers too. Between two different news agencies I spoke to, we all got three different FOIAs. So it seems there's a huge problem with tracking these kids and the chain of command on whether or not they're reporting when they're supposed to. And a lot of people will say these children might be runaways, but I got a demographic breakdown. There's babies missing. How does a baby run away? And my real goal here is to make sure that these 193 are found, that they're not being locked in hospitals, that they're not being sex trafficked. This is the reality. Children in foster care are at much higher risk of trauma and of things happening to them. And if they go missing, who's looking for them? It
So
just raises so
whereabouts
many questions.
so whereabouts unknown are not just 12, 14, 16-year-olds. These are small children.
Yeah. And I've done this
Wow.
nationwide. I've sent in FOIAs to almost every state in the United States to figure out the missing children. Maryland is one that I've been working on very deeply as well. They lost over 880 kids. And this is not just missing children, these are missing foster children. They lost 880 kids in 5 years, and more than half of them were girls from the same county. In my mind, that points directly at child trafficking. Now, Illinois is not being responsive with the documents to tell me where these kids are going missing from. We don't even know if 193 is the accurate number, but they do need a system in place to make sure this doesn't continue to happen.
Wow, that's unthinkable, and to think that you went from your own child being removed to this trail of uncovering this atrocity. I mean, what does this say about government oversight, and where do you feel like the system failed you most? Was it the hospital system? Was it Child Protective Services, the courts, all of the above? Where do you feel like you were failed the most?
All of it. I believe that I was failed in all of it. It takes, like I said, it takes 48 hours to lose all rights to your child. And that's medical rights, physical custody, everything for your child. Within 48 hours, you could never have it again. And it's an uphill battle, especially when they don't allow you to have a lawyer for that first hearing. And it seems such a strange chain of events and something that's supposed to be set up perfectly so it's accessible to parents, so our rights aren't violated. But there is no due process and there's no oversight making sure that they're following their policy. And that goes for the hospitals, that goes for the court system, and it goes for DCFS. Where is the oversight to make sure that they're doing things by the book? When I couldn't find the oversight, I started being the oversight and I started working cases with different families. My phone number is online. Anybody can call me at any time if they've got questions with the case. My email's online. This is my life now. Not only am I raising my children and homeschooling my children and healing them, but I'm also doing everything I can to return kids home all across the United States to their families, to their loving families.
Well, from everything you've learned with your own experience and helping other families, what do you advise parents when navigating medical care, when wanting a second opinion about, a recommendation like chemotherapy or an injection that has a black box warning? Are there ways that you could have avoided this now that you have all this experience?
It's a tricky question. I would say a lot of people don't know when it's coming and it happens so fast. But there's something that I would advise to parents, especially parents of newborn babies. They're doing a lot with these vaccines now, which can remove your child from you if you say no to the vaccines. So I think it's very important that any expecting mother should already have a religious exemption written up by the time their child is born for that child. I think that it's really important that all parents who do not want to vaccinate need to get religious exemptions. And if anybody needs help filing one of those, you can reach out to me. I do this all the time. I think that's a first good step to have those exemptions on file. Another option you could have is if CPS gets involved in any way, shape, or form, immediately get a hold of a lawyer. You don't have to speak to them until you have a lawyer to give you proper advice on how to handle it. It's very particular about who you need to have as a lawyer. I got a lawyer from out of state because Illinois, just the whole way that Illinois politics and Illinois judicial system works, it's just not ideal to try to fight back for your child unless you have a licensed attorney from a different state. It's
Can you dem can you
yeah, go
demand a warrant if they come onto your property that 25 days after diagnosis? Could you have sat there and demanded a warrant, or
I
do they
did.
not need one?
I did demand a warrant. I actually kept them outside for 7 hours. I wouldn't let them in my house. I was hiding with my children. At this time, my ex showed up and he let them right in the house, but I would not let them take my son until they had a warrant, which is why they went to the state's attorney and lied to obtain a warrant. And the basis of the lie is they said it'd been over 2 months that my son had been diagnosed without treatment. And since I couldn't stand up for myself in those first 48 hours because I didn't frame it properly, I was pro se. They didn't offer me a lawyer. I couldn't find one within 48 hours of, my son's taken. I'm in the ambulance with him. Then we go from one hospital to the next in an ambulance. And then the next day it's a court hearing. I'm so overwhelmed with all the things happening in the hospital. I didn't know you should call a lawyer. You should get this ready. I figured they'd have one appointed to me, but court appointed lawyers in these situations, it's not a good idea either. The only thing that I think I could have done differently is immediately taken my son to the hospitals I wanted to take him to and demanded he was seen there. But either way, I had records of him seeing other doctors or conversations with other doctors, and that was not enough to prove that it wasn't neglect.
So you're saying, you hadn't even really declined treatment yet, but you're saying when you know that there's gonna be a misalignment in how you wanna care for your child and how the mainstream medical protocol does, that you should immediately get your ducks in a row with an attorney and with a doctor who's willing to care for your child.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that we're in such a climate, at least we were back then, that doctors really can't stand up for holistic rights either. Back then, things are changing in the recent year, and I'm really loving watching the way things are changing. And I'm hoping it opens doors for families to be able to heal their children instead of using mustard gas to try to cure a problem. Chemotherapy has never been called the cure for anything, it's a treatment. So I firmly believe there's still a cure out there.
So you're unique in a sense that most moms would want to move on from this and never unearth this situation again. But you didn't move on quietly. Not only are you fighting for other parents and uncovering information, but now you've decided to run for office. So Stand for Health Freedom has endorsed you in the 2026 Vote for Health Freedom campaign. And why did you decide to take this to the next level and engage politically?
I had to. I feel a lot of how do I word this? I feel a pull in my heart that I can't sit still and I can't be quiet. And I'm so grateful to God for getting us through this that I know He needs me to do some work now. And it can't be an anomaly. This could not have only been my child. And the more research I've done, the more talking I've done. For example, I just looked up children in Illinois DCFS care without a registered social security number and the costing of the Medicaid charges there. We saw a 725% increase in the past 4 years for the cost of undocumented children on Medicaid in DCFS care to the tune of $66 million. Again, with what happened to my child, this raises so many questions on what is happening in those hospitals to these children.
Wow. So I'm just now putting the dots together that you're saying the missing children are the ones that have the increase in medical expenses.
It's a possibility. I can't confirm because of the confidentiality involved with DCFS. I can only speculate and I can show numbers, but I can't confirm that the 193 are the increased charges. I would ask questions on whether or not these 193 kids are still getting state benefits, whether it's Social Security funds, which they still receive my son's Social Security disability, and it's been over a year and a half that he's been back with me, and they're still not reallocating the funds to my son. And they had them the entire time they had my son in the hospital as well. They never allocated those funds to my son. They never allocated them to my family for the gas money. And we lost our home in the midst of this. We lost literally everything except for our family. We got to stay together at the end of it. But I think it raises questions on whether or not there's widespread fraud, if there's extra Medicaid charges that shouldn't be in there, or if there's medical trafficking happening within Illinois DCFS to more than just my son.
Wow. Do you use the word medical kidnapping? Is that a term that you use or you think appropriately describes the situation?
I mentioned it and it was used against me in court quite often that I even mentioned it one time. But I was on a group chat of moms whose children had cancer, who were doing holistic things to try to help their children's cancer. And one by one, we all got picked off by flies and our children taken from us.
Did anyone survive it? Do you know anyone who's gone against cancer recommendations and not had state involvement?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, St. Jude's was doing a cannabis trial on DIPG brain cancer. And Pray for Gray, if you look up that documentary, she's made it through brain cancer, shrinking brain cancer that is absolutely uncurable in the medical realm. They're doing this. There's so many things that I've met so many people who treat things holistically, but they're not given the credit and they kind of do it in the background, in the dark, because they're afraid of what will happen if the medical field finds out. It's not just child abuse, there's also dependent elderly adult abuse. So if an adult wanted to pursue holistic treatment, they also might end up with APS at their door.
Wow. And it's interesting that you say the mother that is curing an incurable type of cancer because that's what we've seen in a lot of these cases is if there's not a standard of care established, then the mom has a little more wiggle room with having an opinion.
Right.
It's when the mom asks for a second opinion with an established standard of care that things come up against the system and don't work well for parental rights. I mean, I say don't work well, that's a very mild way to put it. It causes nightmares. But what we've been seeing is there's such a heightened risk now with the biotech industry wanting to label children by their genetics. And how many faith-filled homes will reject that genetic diagnosis and come up against a quote unquote established standard of care. So
Right.
we both know that medical kidnappings don't happen in a vacuum. I mean, The strength of the medical industry, school based health centers, unchecked agency power, they all contribute to these outcomes. So, what would you say to parents listening right now who feel powerless or afraid?
You're not alone. I too felt powerless and afraid, but once I made it through, I realized just how much of a force I can be to fix this and to help other families. I am one of the most stubborn people you ever meet, and it's not stubborn to a fault, but I'm stubborn in the fact that we are given constitutional protections, we are given God-given rights, and nobody should infringe on those, especially the rights of a parent to choose what happens with their child, a loving parent to choose what happens to their child. There's never been any allegations that I was not a loving, good parent. My other two children were kept in my custody this entire time. The judge even made comments, well, you don't think she's a bad mom because you kept her other two children at home. This is all about the medical aspect. I think I don't even know what type of advice to give to somebody who feels like I felt, other than to reach out to people, specifically people you know who are fighting this fight with you, and they'll be your best advocate.
That is a very good point that you said that so many families you talk to where they remove the medically fragile child and none of the other children. And so it's a clear medical war. It's
Right.
not a war on whether this mom is fit or competent or loving. It's a medical thing. And so going in to your race for the 94th district in the state house of Illinois, what are the things that you want to champion in the halls of government?
Well, the first thing was the missing children, and it seems that they've already got a Senate bill out for that. So I think the more I dig, the more direction I'll have it exactly where I want to go. But I do think that it's important that we have a voice in the Illinois House of Representatives that is strictly about parental rights and medical freedom. Right now, we've got voices and they've got ideas, but I don't see anybody championing this the way that I am. This is my platform. This is the hill that I will die on to make sure children aren't being dismembered in hospitals without their parents' consent.
So if you could write your perfect health freedom bill for the state of Illinois, what would it look like?
It would be Drew's Law. I've already written it. I've worked on this since the first time I went to Washington, D.C. I've made some tweaks here and there to it, but it would make sure that second opinions are mandated. Second, third, as many opinions as that parent wants. It is not called doctor shopping if you don't feel comfortable with the doctor who is supposed to be taking care of your child. You need to find somebody you feel comfortable with. You need to find somebody you could trust. And I've talked to a lot of other parents in the cancer realm, and they had some good doctors. They appreciated who they had, whether their child survived or not. I just wanted to be able to feel like I had a doctor I could talk to for my son and to be involved in my son's treatment and to be heard. So I would make sure that that is something that's mandated, that CPS should not be getting involved in these diagnoses that are between the parents and the child and the medical field of their choosing.
That's the thing right there is that we get to choose our providers. The government does not get to choose our experts. They don't get to choose our healers. And that is the core of parental rights, of choosing who has a voice in your child's life. I mean, there's this one, I think his name's Dr. Siegel. He wrote a book about loving medicine and miracles. And he talks about the way that he frames a prognosis to a child and their family dramatically changes their
Yeah,
outcomes. It's like that's how important your choice of provider is. Your provider's perspective changes outcomes for a child. And that's why parents have to have exactly what you are describing. And that is the fundamental core God given right to choose which adults get to participate in the care of your child.
right.
So, Bailey, thank you so much for trusting us with your story and for stepping up to lead with such courage during this time. You are endorsed by Stand for Health Freedom. Stand for Health Freedom is proud to put you on our voter guide and to let the 94th District of Illinois know that they have someone running to represent them well for health freedom in the state house. So, is there anything else that you would like to say to the voters? Where are your voters located in Illinois?
We are in the 94th district, so it's going to be most of the Iowa border is where my voters are located, and most of us are in farming communities, people who really don't like to deal with government intervention to begin with. And when this situation happened with my son, it really rocked our community. And I don't want to see it happen again to my family or any other family. Now, I've got that dismissed with prejudice so they can never come back after me for medical neglect of Drew, but it doesn't mean they can't come after everyone else. And I don't want anybody to feel the way that I felt or feel the way that my son felt being locked away from his family. So I'm here as a fighter, a stubborn one at that. And I'll get down to the bottom of it. I like to do research and I like to do FOIAs. So I want to bring the constitutional law back to Illinois that we're so much lacking right now.
And that's exactly why Stand for Health Freedom endorses Bailey Templeton for Illinois State House, because her story represents exactly why the health freedom movement exists. And her willingness to go above and beyond with sophistication, with real solutions, is truly unmatched. So if you want to listen, sorry, edit. If you want to learn more and support endorsed candidates or protect parental rights and informed consent, visit standforhealthfreedom.com. We are entering a robust season for the 2026 midterms, and we all need to be informed and share this information. So, Bailey, where can listeners find out more about your campaign?
Well, you can Google me. My name is all over on Google now. I find that so enthralling, and it's all the research I've done, all the FOIA work I've done. The Center Square has done amazing at giving me a platform to speak to people about what I'm finding. Or you can look me up on my website, which is baileytempleton.nationbuilder.com. On there as well, there's a FOIA page which will show you all the information that I've dug up. We're looking for boots on the ground. We're looking for people to help us door knock. I'm running my campaign in such a weird way. I'm called a not serious candidate because I'm not taking big donations from different groups. I'm really just trying to show people I'm running a Ronald Reagan campaign. I want to talk to the people, show the people who I am, and let them know that I'm not participating in these political games. I'm here for them. And a lot of people in 2026, they're tired of the politics. They want real voices and real people who are going to fight for them. And I'm just your girl for that.
We appreciate you and sharing your story. So we will be following along. Go to baileytempleton.nationbuilder.com so you can find out more about her race and support health freedom candidates in 2026. Thank you so much.
Thank you.